In early Dungeons & Dragons, playing a paladin wasn't just about being holy. It meant risking everything if you ever slipped. So why did Gary Gygax make the paladin the hardest class to play? And why is the class so misunderstood? I talk about the evolution of the paladin, edition by edition, today on Daddy Rolled a One. Hello there, and welcome back. I'm Martin, and this is another video in my series on the history of early tabletop role-playing games, including Dungeons & Dragons. It's also part of my history of D&D classes, because today we're going to be talking about the Paladin, edition by edition. And what I mean by that is that I'm going to be going through the differences in the class as it appears in various editions of Dungeons & Dragons, and I'm specifically talking about the TSR era of D&D. So starting with original edition, which comes out in 1974, and then going up through second edition, Advanced D&D, which debuts in 1989, and it's going to last until the year 2000, at which point third edition is going to come out, published by Wizards of the Coast. So in this video, actually this time I am very briefly at the end of the video going to just talk about some changes that did happen, more like kind of philosophically to the class. I'm not going to go over the mechanics, but for third, fourth, and fifth edition, just to talk about how the class is being presented in a different way than it originally was in the TSR era, which was pretty consistent from edition to edition. So I've been doing these deep dives in this playlist that you can see here. I've done one so far on the fighter, one on the cleric, and one on the magic user. And those are the only original three core classes from original D&D in 1974. So from this point on, if I continue this series, every class that I'll be doing will be, quote unquote new, because it will be something that did not appear in the original edition of Dungeons and Dragons. So what I'm going to do in this particular video, so that you understand what you're getting into, is that I'm going to go over the etymology of the word paladin. Where does that word come from? What does it mean? And that will help us to understand why the term was used for this kind of class in Dungeons and Dragons. And then that's going to morph into some like historical, mythical, and fictional inspirations for the class for putting it into Dungeons and Dragons. Then I'm going to get into that edition by edition discussion to talk about its debut, which is in here, Greyhawk Supplement 1, 1975. A year after D&D comes out, and then go through the different editions of D&D. First, I'm going to start with what I call the basic line of D&D, that's colloquially known as basic, or could just be called Dungeons and Dragons, but that's going to be the like Holmes basic, Moldvay Cook Marsh basic, or BX, and then the BECMI edition from 1983. So I'm going to go through that, and then I'm going to come back and do Advanced D&D first edition from 1978, which is when the Player's Handbook comes out. And we're going to dig a little bit into Unearthed Arcana from 1985 for first edition, because there are some major changes to the Paladin made in this particular book. And then I'm going to wrap it up with second edition Advanced D&D. And I will briefly also talk about the complete Paladin's Handbook that was published for second edition. And then, like I said, I'll do a little overview of third through fifth editions. That'll take like 5 minutes tops for all three combined. And then at the very end of the video, I am going to have a brief discussion on some ideas and tips and advice for both players and DMs to help distinguish clerics from paladins, because it's a question that's been asked since the paladin class debuted, is how to sort of role play them different and tell the differences. Mechanically, it's easier, but philosophically or flavor wise, it's very difficult sometimes to tell the difference. And so I'll have some tips for that at the end of the video. So it's going to be a long video, but all of that is the video. So I know someone's going to come in the comments and say, oh, the video starts when I start talking about the Paladin from Greyhawk. Nope, the video starts now, because the etymology is something that I think is really fascinating and helps us to understand the way that the class was developed and why it was called that. So if that kind of history in these deep dive looks into the history of Dungeons and Dragons is something that you find interesting and educational and informative, then please take a few seconds to like the video, double check to make sure that you're subscribed to the channel, and then please adjust the settings on that bell icon so that YouTube will alert you when I upload new videos like this one. But let's go ahead and jump in with this etymology. This is what I'm talking about. And I think this, again, is interesting. I found it with my video on the Lich recently, and also with my video on the secret origins of D&D's demons and devils. I went over the origins of some of these words and terms that we use, and I'm getting a lot of feedback from people saying that like they find that very, very interesting. And that's why I'm including it in the videos. Okay. So the word paladin, this is a definition. I think this is from Merriam-Webster's dictionary, but it says any of the 12 peers of Charlemagne's court, and that the Count Palatine was sort of like the highest level of them. Okay, but it's also described as a knight renowned for their heroism and chivalry. Okay, so that's all well and good, but what we want to understand is, okay, why does it mean that? Where did this word come from? Well, it comes to us from the French paladin, and I'm not great at French, sorry. It's spelled the same way. It's supposed to be pronounced differently, which in turn comes from an Italian word paladino, which in turn comes from a Latin word palatinus. So a palatinus was a high-level official attached to imperial or royal courts in Europe since Roman times, but very specifically, this Latin word is the Roman version. So it's first used in ancient Rome for chamberlains of the emperor due to their association with Palatine Hill. So Palatine Hill is one of the 7 hills of Rome. Rome is built around these 7 hills, and the Palatine Hill is kind of the most central one, and it was considered the nucleus of the city, which thereby extension means it's also then the nucleus of either the Roman Republic or the Roman Empire, depending on which period of time you're talking about, if it's kind of the center or the nucleus of the city of Rome. And Augustus built his royal palace there on Palatine Hill. And before that, it was the home of sort of the upper class, the rich people in the city tended to live on Palatine Hill. So I wanted to dig a little bit deeper and figure out, well, where does this word Palatine come from? Why was it called Palatine Hill? And what does that mean? And the thought is that this isn't like 100% definitive, but most people believe that it comes from the Latin word palatum, which basically means the roof of your mouth or the palate. Okay, but what's interesting is that a lot of people then think that that word, palatum, comes from an Etruscan word, phalid or phalad, which means sky. And so what we're going to see is that around 200 BC-ish, a Roman poet and writer named Ennius, or Aeneas, Ennius, he's going to write a poem, and he's going to use this word palatum as basically an analogy for heaven. So going all the way back, I think it's really interesting that this word that is eventually going to morph into the term paladin that we use in English has connections to, quote unquote, heaven, or like the sky, heavenly things, going all the way back to the Latin root word. And I think that helps to make that connection with paladins being sort of these holy warriors. Okay, so now, interestingly enough, there's some other uses of the word Palatinus that we're going to see throughout Rome. So one of them is the Scholae Palatinae. So they were a personal army of the emperor, and that the emperor was allowed to take on campaigns. So we see it mostly in like the Byzantine Empire part of the Roman Empire, like in the later ages, but it dates back to this group of schools that were part of this ancient Salii brotherhood of the god of war Mars. There were 2 of them, and the more prestigious and oldest one had these priests. They were known as Salian priests, and they were called the leaping priests. There were 12 of them, very interestingly enough. And they were priests of the god of war, and they were patrician use. So patrician meaning, upper class, not plebeian. So that's the lower class. So patrician use dressed as archaic warriors. They wore embroidered tunics. They had breastplates, short red cloaks, swords, and spiked headdresses. And one of the things that they were supposedly charged with was keeping these 12 shields known as ancilia. One of the 12 was said to have been sent from heaven or fallen from heaven during the reign of King Numa. So they had this sort of religious connection to them, being for the god of war, but also carrying this artifact that's said to have come from heaven itself. So that's the Scholae Palatinae. Now, as we go on through the Roman Empire ages, we're going to morph into like the late Roman Empire and then get into the Middle Ages. And we're going to see this term come up, comes palatinus. Okay, so the comes palatinus basically is going to translate into English as Count Palatine. That's what it translates to. And they were a title became attached to courts beyond the imperial one, for one. So they're moving outside. And one of the highest level officials, as an example, in the papal administration was called the Judices Palatinus, or Palatini, sorry. And during the Merovingian and Carolingian dynasties, we have these Comes Palatinus, and they also had them in the Roman or the Holy Roman Empire. Okay, so as we continue on, but they are officials of the sovereign's household, and in particular of the sovereign's court of law in the imperial palaces. So the word palace goes back to that word Palatinus and the Palatine Hill. That they're all these words are connected. That's why they all kind of look and sound the same. But the functions of these Comes Palatinus are going to start to extend into more administrative functions. So they're going to start dividing these up by kind of the functions that they have. So I have some listed here, but you have the Comes Cubiculariorum, who oversaw the chamberlains. You have the Comes Scanciorum, who directed the cupbearers. And you have the Comes Stabulorum, who directed the equerries in charge of the stables. And then you have the Comes Patronomium, who are in charge of the patrimonial or the private real estate of the king. And so you have these different functions for different people who all had the same title, Comes Palatinus, but they start to slot them into different areas. And I think that's a fun way you could look at sort of dividing your paladins up in your D&D game by having different paladins in charge of different types of things. Okay. Now, one of the things that's going to happen is that some of these Comes Palatinus, the Counts Palatine, are going to start to be sent on missions to various parts of the empire to act as judges and governors and things like that. So the districts that they rule come to be known as palatinates. So that's where that word comes from, because it was put in charge of these people, these high-level imperial or, royal officials, noble officials, okay? So again, but this idea that they're being sent by the king or the emperor is another way that you can think of paladins in your D&D games, a way to give missions, right? So it's like a soft hook to get them involved by just, well, it's not even a soft hook, it's a direct hook, get them involved in a mission by sending them because they are sort of, they're reporting to somebody else. Now, the concept of these Comes Palatinos is going to expand in French literature, French courtly literature from the 12th century. So they're going to use the term paladins to describe the 12 closest champions of Charlemagne, the 12 peers, okay? And the number 12 is being used here. I think it's fun that has a connection going back to like this, that Scolae Palatini, but like that Salii, the Salian Brotherhood or the Leaping Priests. I thought that was really, really interesting that it's still 12, but also they're connecting it to the 12 apostles. They're trying to make this connection that these people were holy and that they had a connection to like the divine spirit and this kind of thing. So that's why the number is 12. Now, the most famous of these is going to be the Song of Roland, which is written somewhere around 1040 to 1115 AD, again in French. And now what's interesting is that you have these 12 peers or 12 paladins, but the names always change. So there's always 12, but it's never consistent what the names are. Usually the two that are pretty consistent throughout is going to be Roland and Oliver. And then you're also going to see pretty frequently Ogier the Dane. You're going to see Archbishop Turpin, and then a knight named Ganelon, who's actually going to end up betraying the Paladins. There's a whole story about that. One of the most famous battles is the one where they're defending, the entry into France from Spain, from the Muslim army that was invading from Spain. So, and Ganelon's going to betray them. So that's another thing you can put into your ideas. It's like, yeah, you can have fallen Paladins, and that's a very common trope, but it's common for a reason because it works. All right. So in the Italian Renaissance, it's going to get expanded even more. So you're going to build on and expand on these legends of things that they're doing, going beyond just, the historical kinds of things that Charlemagne was doing. And you're going to see them being sent on mission to recover holy relics and do really fantastical things. So that's going to happen in the Italian Renaissance. And then you're going to get operas in the Baroque era that are going to expand it even more. Okay, so now we're going to see the term being sort of revived and used in the early modern period. So as an example, in the 30 Years' War, which is, I think, like the 1660s, the leaders of Frederick V's armies were known as his paladins. Okay, and then coming all the way up into the late 1800s. So in Germany, pre-World War II, this is when Germany was an empire, there were three people known as the Paladins of the Empire, one of whom is Otto von Bismarck. So if you know your German history, you know he's going to end up becoming chancellor and ruling for quite a while pre-World War I. But that German connection doesn't end there. Even in World War II, Hitler's number two, Göring, was known as his Paladin. So they use that word. That's less than 100 years ago, that term being used. And I believe it's still used in certain parts of the world today to kind of identify these high-level officials in government, okay, going all the way back to that early Roman time period where they were imperial officials at the palace on Palatine Hill. Let's dive into a little bit of the inspirations for putting it into the game. So Tim Kask very specifically says he was convinced that the idea just wholly came from Gary. So this is from a comments that he made on the Dragon's Foot forums. And as you remember, Tim Kask, hopefully you remember, first employee at TSR. So the very first person that the company hired when they have enough money to hire an employee. And he's eventually going to become the editor of Strategic Review magazine, which is later going to then become Dragon magazine. He's going to stay editor there for a while. So, and he consulted on a ton of projects while he's there, and was close with Gary and the other folks. So Tim says that he's strongly convinced that Gary himself created the class, and he said because it is so rigid a PC class. This is a quote. He says, that smacks of Gary's fiendish wit. Make a character truly extraordinary and make it really tough to play in terms of always having to do the right thing, always. So that's Tim Kask's kind of description of thinking that, like, you know, Gary sort of created that class from whole cloth, which, you know, I don't know that we can necessarily argue with that, because I don't think that we have any details of the mechanics. I'm not saying the idea, the archetype of a holy knight, of course it's there, but the mechanics of differentiating it from just a standard fighter, or, you know, as they call it at the time, fighting man, and giving it these abilities and stuff, that does seem to maybe come from Gary. We'll talk a little bit about that moving forward. But where does Gary get the idea? Well, very interestingly enough, Gary's going to say, now this is a quote that he made on, I think this was EN World. So I got some quotes from EN World, also from the OD&D boards. And one person said that he wrote Gary asking him a question, and Gary wrote him back a letter actually explaining this. So I'm going to mix all these quotes together, but this is all Gary talking. So he says, the class takes vows, swears an oath, and then follows it. The concept is drawn from some legend, Arthurian, and some quasi-legend, the Paladins of Charlemagne, plus the Code of Chivalry as it was written. More honored in the breach than in the keeping. As described in the game system, any character that was of Paladin class would cease being so immediately his vows were broken. So there's some typos and some words left out, but I'm reading it as Gary wrote it. And then he says, playing a proper Paladin is often mishandled also. They are not stupid per se, only bound by oaths. I don't know where the stupid thing came from, but it's been a long trope of people thinking that paladins are kind of stupid. He says, for example, I did allow paladins to slay dangerous prisoners if those individuals renounced evil. So this is on Ian World. There's much more to this quote. A lot of people debate the words and the terminology and the examples and metaphors that Gary gives, and I'm not going to get into that here, so you can read that and make up your own mind about that. But I'm really just here to talk about like the origins. Where did the class come from? And then he says, anyway, while Paul Anderson in his excellent 3 Hearts and 3 Lions was treating Ogier the Dane as his protagonist, that work was not the source for the Paladin class. I did borrow a good deal from the troll he had in the yarn, though. So we're going to talk about 3 Hearts and 3 Lions here in a second. And then he says, in truth, I was using the older sources for the model of the Paladin, and the 12 Paladins of Charlemagne was my main inspiration. Of course, it didn't hurt that I had been told the story of Roland at about age 3. So Gary's going to double down and say it's coming from Charlemagne, and that's where he got the idea to include the Paladin, and that's it. Right. But for years, decades, people have been saying that the Paladin was inspired by the character of Holger Carlson in this book, 3 Hearts and 3 Lions by Paul Anderson, which is one of the books cited in the Appendix N in the Dungeon Master, one of the authors at least, as being inspirational for Dungeons and Dragons. So, and he just says he got the idea for the troll, very specifically the idea that the troll is going to regenerate. That comes from Paul Anderson. Also alignment comes from Anderson, this specific book, the law versus chaos dichotomy that is in original Dungeons and Dragons, comes from Three Hearts and Three Lions. There's no good and evil in original Dungeons and Dragons, if you didn't know that. It's just law, neutrality, and chaos. And in here, the forces of law in this book are fighting against the force of chaos. Now, that's also related to Michael Moorcock's stuff with the Melniboné series and Elric and Stormbringer and all that kind of stuff. But those concepts, a lot of them came from this book. But then Gary's going to say, but the Paladin is not coming from this book, even though Holger Karlsson is essentially acting as a paladin throughout this book. So we're going to talk about that in just a second. But this is Three Hearts and Three Lions. Actually, let's just talk about it now. So in this book, and this is going to be spoilers if you haven't read it, which I highly recommend you do read it. It's a fun story. It's not that long. I mean, you can see it's pretty short. But Holger Karlsson is a World War II era. Well, he is in World War II. He's a Danish engineer, and he's fighting some Nazis. He gets shot, and when he awakens, he's in a parallel universe, and he is surrounded by all this equipment and horse of a medieval knight that's like basically waiting for him. So again, there's a mount. There is a horse waiting for him. He dons the equipment, and there's a lot of stuff that's going to happen. But eventually, what's going to happen is he's going to go on a quest to find this magic sword. And so he finds the sword, and when he does so, he realizes that he is essentially a form of the legendary Ogier the Dane that we talked about, one of the 12 peers of Charlemagne, or the 12 paladins of Charlemagne. And he uses those powers as Ogier the Dane to defeat the enemies and forces of chaos here. And then he returns home with the powers that he still has and is able to, like almost at the exact instant that he left, he's able to defeat the Nazis that he was fighting when he was whisked away to this parallel world. Okay. So there's way more to the story than that. There's a love story in here that's really interesting. And, you know, there's other creatures and all this kind of stuff. I'm just giving you the quick beats here. But, what's very interesting is, again, the way that Holger Karlsson acts in here, and the fact that he's got this mount that's just waiting for him as though it were called to him. And then he's using all the trappings and stuff of the of a type of paladin, and he's fighting the forces of chaos. He's a champion of law. Okay. All of that to me like screams paladin. And then Gary admits that he read the book, but he wasn't influenced by the character in here. And I think that's an interesting thing for Gary to say. I'm not saying he's lying. I'm very much sure that he was inspired by the legends of Charlemagne, but I do think that there were some elements from this story that had to have crept their way into his mind when he was working on developing the paladin class. Okay. So that's Three Hearts and Three Lions. Now, very quickly, I also want to talk about some pre-D&D sources, like game sources, where we might see a paladin show up. So first, let's look at Chainmail. Okay, so this is Rules for Medieval Miniatures. And in Chainmail, you do, of course, have knights. It's on page 18, if I can get there. Okay, so you have knights, and it says feudal knights were ill-disciplined and generally refused to take orders from anyone, even their liege lord. So they're not really painting them in a great light. And so it talks about, like, if more than one type of enemy troops are within charging distance, the order of precedence that a knight will follow is for, like, this is who they're going to attack. Other knights, then any other mounted troops, then baggage or missile troops firing on them. Okay, and then armored foot, missile armored troops. I'm just not going to read the whole list here, but you see, there's an order by which the knight will attack certain enemies first because they're considered more prestigious to attack, and so it gets you more glory if you attack them and defeat them first. So those are knights. Of course, this is medieval miniatures rules. So there's nothing fantastical in here. There's no fantastical, any kind of like powers or anything like that for the knight. However, when we get to the fantasy supplement, the very famous fantasy supplement here in Chainmail, we're not going to see paladins, but what we are going to see are heroes. And let's read this description. It says heroes and anti-heroes. Included in this class are certain well-known knights, leaders of army contingents, and similar men. They have the fighting ability of 4 figures, the class being dependent on the arms and equipment of the hero types themselves, who can range from light foot to heavy horse. Heroes and anti-heroes never need check morale. That means they're not going to be fearful. They're not going to run away from fear. Okay. And they add 1 to the die or dice of their unit they are with. They're the last figure in a unit that will be killed by regular missile fire or melee. This is missile fire of melee, but I think it's supposed to say or melee. But they may be attacked individually by enemy troops of like types, such as other hero types or creatures shown on the fantasy combat table. So they can act independent of their command, blah, blah, blah. So they have these powers that other characters don't have. Never needing to check morale is kind of a power, that kind of thing. And then you have the superhero, which is essentially like it's a twice strength hero. So they're like one-man armies, it basically says. When a superhero approaches with his charge movement within his charge movement of the enemy, all such units must check morale as if they had taken excess casualties. So there's this aura that the superhero puts away that's going to frighten lesser creatures. Okay, so there you've got your closest examples that you're going to see in chainmail. Of course, these aren't character classes; these are troop types that you're going to use with miniatures, but I mean, you're already starting to see some things that are going to creep into the Paladin class. Now, of course, the other source that we know of that predates Dungeons and Dragons is going to be Blackmoor. Now, Blackmoor does not have, at least originally, pre-Dungeons and Dragons publication, Blackmoor, which predates D&D, did not have classes. They had roles or archetypes or whatever you want to say. People played, what we would call characters, but they weren't classes with like detailed mechanics and things like that. It was a little bit more loose. Okay, so I've talked about this many times here on the channel. But one of the things that Dave Arneson is going to put into this book, this is First Fantasy Campaigns. This is 3 years after the publication of D&D, 1977. And he's going to write this book. And this is basically a lot of notes from his campaign. Not all of them, but there's a lot in here that was sort of like, what was Blackmoor like? Now, one of the interesting sections in here is Blackmoor's more infamous characters. And one of the characters that he's going to talk about here is the Blue Rider. Now, this was played by a man named Bill Heaton. And it says, deep within the mystic history of Blackmoor, there was a mighty warrior who wielded a sword of blue flame and rode a war horse beyond compare. William of the Heath was his name, and his horse Bill were infamous throughout a long stretch of history, riding hither and yon, fighting the forces of evil and carrying off any likely wench encountered. The sword, plate armor, and fully armored war horse were said to belong to a demented old wizard. So basically, the Blue Rider gets this equipment, and then he decides that he wants to take up the challenge of being a good guy. He was kind of like not necessarily a good guy, but he decides he wants to be good. But he becomes this very famous like source of good, this mythic good warrior. Okay, so that is later going to be described. There's a list of characters that played in the Blackmoor game. Someone puts it together and shows it to Dave Arneson before Dave passed, of course, and basically says, like, can you double check this and make sure that this is correct? And the person that made that list identified the Blue Rider as being a paladin. Okay, so now that list was put together after Dungeons and Dragons had come out. And so we know that the Blackmoor players started to incorporate some of the ideas. Okay, so I think that that's fine. But they used the word paladin to describe the Blue Rider because to them, they thought the Blue Rider was acting in a manner that was consistent with the way that the paladin class was described in Dungeons and Dragons, if that makes sense. Now, the other one that's going to be in here is the Great Svenny. I just talked about him recently, played by Greg Svensson. But his character, the Great Svenny, says, longtime pal of the king and first paladin of the kingdom is the Great Svenny, who rose from his humble peasant beginnings to his present great rank. So Dave Arneson describes the Great Svenny as a paladin. So once again, the paladin class did not exist when the Great Svenny was created by Greg Svensson, okay? But later, as they continue to play, they're going to use that term to describe him because they thought that was the closest, analogous class to what the Great Svenny was. So I just think that that's very, very interesting. And, Gary would have been aware of this and would have known that these people were playing. So one wonders how much that would have impacted the idea of wanting to include a paladin class in Dungeons and Dragons. I'm not saying that he was influenced by that, but I don't think it's out of the realm of possibility that he was. Okay, now, so one last thing that I want to just pick from this particular book here is there's a section on special interests, which are essentially skills. And I talked about this in my video on skills. And you see here the character types. He lists Paladin as a character class or character type. So it's right here. So Dave starts to incorporate it into his game because it fit the type of game that he was playing. And again, I think it's very possible that people were playing in the spirit of being a paladin without the actual class mechanics of being a paladin, if that makes sense. Now, the other two things you're going to see in here that might stick out to you are the merchant and sage, which were two roles or archetypes that people played in Dave Arneson's campaign. Well, very interestingly enough, one of the first videos I made was about those two classes. I call it the forgotten classes of D&D or something like that. And within 2.5 years of the channel, it is far and away the most viewed video on my channel of all time. So it's a massive video, and I really don't know what it was that made that particular video take off, but that was the one that was sort of like responsible for me making more history videos because people wanted more of that kind of content. So definitely check that video out if you haven't seen it. It's not very long, but it is one of my more, well, it is the most popular video on the entire channel. All right, so those are some kind of background and inspirations to get us to the creation of the Paladin class. Okay, so let's just finally now dive in, now that we've had that background, and talk about the first appearance of the Paladin, which again is not going to be in original Dungeons and Dragons. It's going to be here, 1974 Greyhawk, or 1975 Greyhawk Supplement 1. Okay, so in the Men and Magic section, it says additions and changes, and it says there are now 4 main classes of characters, and then it says fighting men, and then in parentheses, including paladins. And then it says magic users, clerics, thieves. Okay, and then under fighting men, it says other character types may engage in hand-to-hand combat, but only true fighting men are able to use their strength and dexterity to utmost advantage in melee. In addition, certain lawful fighters may opt to become paladins. This is all explained later in the section entitled Determination of Abilities. So Paladins are not a separate class. You see here, it says there's 4 main classes of characters, and Paladins are listed next to fighting men. So Paladins are going to be considered in this edition what's known as a subclass, and that's going to be pretty consistent in the way that they're depicted all the way through the TSR editions of Dungeons and Dragons. So if you are started in a more modern edition, like 3rd, 4th, or 5th, you're used to Paladin just being a class. And I know 5th edition has subclasses. The use of the word subclass in original D&D and like 1st edition AD&D, Advanced D&D, is different mechanically than the subclasses that you have in 5e. So don't let that term confuse you. Essentially, what subclass in here is going to mean in original D&D and the TSR editions is that you have these 4 main core classes, as it says, 4 main classes: fighting men, magic, clerics, and thieves, magic users, clerics, and thieves. And those are the easiest to qualify for because they pretty much do not have any minimum qualifications. Now that's going to change when we get into advanced D&D, and it's usually going to say you have to have a minimum 9 or something like that, I think, in your prime requisite, if I remember correctly. But in original D&D, you didn't have that. And so, and very specifically, they point out when they're making a character in original D&D, they show how the statistics are rolled, and the player has a higher wisdom. And so it said they would have gained experience more quickly had they chosen to play a cleric. However, the player wanted to play a magic user, even though the intelligence was lower than the wisdom. And so they chose to play a magic user. And the thing was, the only impact that it had was that they're not going to gain experience as fast as had he been a cleric, because in original D&D, again, you should watch my my video on the 6 ability scores, like why D&D has 6 ability scores. But one of the ways that those ability scores are used in original D&D is that if you have a high level or a high number ability score in what's called your prime requisite, which is like strength for fighters, intelligence for magic users, and wisdom for clerics, and then later dexterity for thieves, you get a bonus to your experience points. And that's usually the only thing that ability score does. Now, once you get to Greyhawk, they're going to add things that those ability scores can do. But for the most part, even in here, wisdom doesn't really do a whole heck of a lot. Anyway, that's kind of how these ability scores were put together. But Gary's going to start creating these subclasses, the Paladin being the first one. And the Paladin does have requirements, and very specifically, the requirement's going to be that the Paladin has to have a minimum 17 charisma. So it's very interesting. The class is not described here in the characters section, like the classes. It goes through all the classes, then all the different races. This is where half-elves are going to debut. Then it gets to the determination of abilities, and then buried over here in this section on charisma, this is where you're going to get the details of the Paladin class. And it says charisma scores of 17 or greater by fighters indicate the possibility of Paladin status if they are lawful from the commencement of play for that character. If such fighters elect, they can then become paladins, always doing lawful deeds. For any chaotic act will immediately revoke the status of the paladin, and it can never be regained. So there's no atonement. You make one mistake, and you're done. You're no longer a paladin. So that's what Tim Kask was referring to earlier in that quote. So what's going to happen is these subclasses that Gary starts to develop, which is going to include things like rangers, which came from someone else's idea, but he took it and put it into advanced D&D. and illusionists, same thing. Druids, those are all going to have much stricter requirements and be harder to qualify for, but they're going to share a lot in common with the main classes in terms of hit dice, attack rates, like when did they improve with their attacks. Usually weapon and armor types of restrictions are very, very similar. So assassins are going to appear under thieves and that kind of thing. So they're going to share a lot in common. The saving throw tables, all those are going to be consistent with the main class. So that's why it's a subclass. It's essentially you are that main class plus extra goodies, roughly. So the Paladin is a fighting man with extra goodies. That's it, right? So that's what we're looking at here. Now, what's really interesting is that we have to look at the possibility of creating a Paladin. So if you remember in original D&D, ability scores are generated by rolling by the referee. So the player doesn't roll. The referee rolls 3d6 in order, writes them down: strength, intelligence, wisdom, constitution, dexterity, and charisma. Now later on, they're going to flip-flop dexterity and constitution, but strength, intelligence, wisdom, constitution, dexterity, charisma. Then gets the numbers in order, no modifiers, nothing, and then hands it to the player. And then the player looks at the scores and decides what character class he or she wants to play. And if, wants to be also like a dwarf, elf, or hobbit. Okay. Originally it was hobbit, not halfling. So in order to get a 17, rolling 3d6 6 times, to get a 17 or 18, because you could get an 18 to be 18 charisma to be a paladin. The chance of getting that, I believe, is 1.85%. It's less than 2%. And I think, and I'm not great at math, so somebody correct me if I'm wrong, but since you're rolling in order, it's not like you could roll a 17 or 18 anywhere and then put it into your charisma. You have to roll it exactly in the 6th space. So I think that if I understand math correctly, I think that reduces the chance even below 1.85%. But let's just go with 1.85%. That's not a very big chance to roll up a paladin. And so there weren't that many. Okay, so in Gary's game, I've read some comments from folks, and they said originally in his games, I think they counted 3. They counted 3 paladins, and that's about right. I think if you think of the percentages, because Gary had hundreds of players in his Greyhawk game, okay, and to the point where he had to get a co-DM in the form of Rob Kuntz, who helps him write this. That's why Gary and Rob wrote this together, this Greyhawk supplement. And so you had hundreds of players, and those players are probably playing more than one character. We know James Ward had more than one character, as did Ernie Gygax and all these people. So out of all those hundreds of characters, 3 of them were paladins. If they were following the rules, then that sounds about right. Now, most people, when they're playing, like not in the Greyhawk game, we're going to cheat. If you wanted a paladin, you're going to stack your stats because you want to qualify, right? So I think that's very, very interesting. And also, there's let's just keep going. We'll go and talk about what are the powers of the paladin. It's going to get into that here. And it says, the paladin has a number of very powerful aids in his continual seeking for good. He can lay on hands to cure wounds or diseases and others. 2 points of damage for every level the paladin has obtained. 1 disease per 5 levels, but either function is usable but once per day. Paladins themselves are not subject to disease. They have a 10% higher saving throw against all forms of attack, excluding melee. So basically plus 10%. Just what that means is they get a +2 bonus to all their saving throws. Plus, because 10% of 20 on a d20 is 2. Okay, and it says paladins of 8th level or above dispel evil, spells, undead, evil enchanted monsters, and the like, simply by ordering it hence. And they detect all evil at a range of 6 inches. So remember, inches in original D&D is going to equate because you're using your figures on the table. Okay. And then it's going to say paladins with any form of holy sword are virtually immune to all magic. And so again, we've got that holy sword thing, like Holger Carlson goes on the quest for the magic sword. But if they get a +5 holy avenger sword in here, which is listed in the artifacts, they become immune to magic. So the saving throws are relevant. They're not going to be affected by it. And then it says the paladin may at any time he chooses obtain a horse, which is likewise gifted. But if the horse dies, you can't summon another one for 10 years. You can go buy another horse, but you can summon a special horse. And it's going to be a heavy war horse with armor class 5 that moves 18, and it has 5+1 hit dice, and it has high intelligence. So, but if that dies, you can't get another one for 10 years. So, again, remember when Holger Carlson gets transported to the Magic Land, there's a horse there waiting for him, as though it had been summoned. And then it says, Paladins will never be allowed to possess more than 4 magical items, excluding the armor, shield, and up to 4 weapons they normally use, and they will give away all treasure that they win, save that which is necessary to maintain themselves, their men, and a modest castle. Gifts must be to the poor or to charitable or religious institutions. That is not some other character played in the game. A paladin's stronghold cannot be above 200,000 gold pieces in total cost, and no more than 200 men can be retained to guard it. Paladins normally prefer to dwell with lawful princes or patriarchs, but circumstances may prevent this. They will associate only with lawful characters. So that's all he's going to say about paladins in here in this particular book. So what's interesting here, a few things. So you're starting to see powers that we're going to see associated with the paladin throughout the TSR editions. This laying on of hands to heal, this curing of disease, the being immune to disease, the bonus to saving throws, the war horse. Although in here you can call it at any time. In future editions, you're going to have to be higher level. The special abilities that you get by carrying the holy sword. Now, some of the other things that you don't see here, which are going to be very common, are things like turning undead, which is a trope. Also notice that this paladin doesn't cast any spells. There's no spell casting. However, these abilities could thought of to be divine. Now, what's interesting is that somebody did ask him, and this is the player that I told you about that wrote to Gary and said, like, where did the paladin's powers kind of come from? This kind of thing. And Gary wrote him back. And because the person said, I always thought that they got the power from, like just being a force of good and law. And it kind of came from within, and they're drawing on this power of law to get these powers. And Gary wrote him back, and he said, the paladins assumed to be devoted to lawful good as directed by a specific deity, or as a set of lawful good deities in a pantheon. The power was not contemplated as coming from within. So that's Gary's point of view. However, this never says that. It doesn't tell you where these powers come from at all. And I think in original D&D, because there's no clerical spell casting like we're going to see in future editions, it's even less tenuous that you have to be connected to a deity. Now, it does say that you have to tithe it doesn't use the word tithe, but it says you have to give away your excess treasure to a religious institution. It's very clear about that, but it doesn't say that it has to be one that you really belong to. So, you could quibble about that back and forth, but I think that the way that it's presented here, it's not necessarily clear where this paladin's powers are coming from. All that you really know is that it's extremely difficult to qualify for. Less than 2% of characters are going to roll that dice in order on 3d6 to get that charisma score. And then they might not even want to play a paladin, but they could if they wanted to and so chose to be. Now, a couple other things that we saw in here is that it said lawful fighting men with charisma 17 or higher, if they choose, can become paladins. It doesn't say lawful human fighting men, and I'm pointing that out because that's going to be relevant later. So technically, according to this, hobbits, dwarves, and even elves, who are a combination of fighting man and magic user in this version of the game, if they're lawful and had charisma 17 plus, they could all qualify to be paladins. They could be paladins. And there were some. People talked about, like, I had a dwarf paladin, but that's going to change in future editions. But according to the original rules here in Greyhawk Supplement 1, other races could be paladins. That's not a new invention. Now, was it an oversight in here? I think most likely, given the direction the game took during the TSR era, but technically it's legal. So I made some of these charts. I've done these charts before. So if you've seen my video on the fighter class, I would very specifically recommend that you check that one out, because a lot of these details are going to be repetitive with the fighter class. But I made this chart to talk about the hit points, their armor class, the damage they're going to do, that kind of thing, and compare them edition by edition. And the first thing I did to start out was I had to stat this character up. Now, what's interesting is that although in original D&D, the only requirement is a 17 charisma, as you go later in future editions, they have very, very strict requirements. And so I wanted to make sure I was hitting those requirements so that, this is a legal, quote unquote, character. And so I had to use method 1 from the Dungeon Master's Guide. That's the one I chose from 1979 for advanced D&D, which is roll 4d6, subtract 1, like drop the lowest die. So, which is what a lot of people do now anyway. That's sort of become the default, but it wasn't the default at the time that Greyhawk came out. So I rolled that, and I had to do it 4 different times. So I rolled the scores in order. But I had to roll it 4 different times until I got a character that qualified. And that's because once you get to advanced D&D, a paladin needs a minimum of 12 strength, 9 intelligence, 9 constitution, 13 wisdom, and 17 charisma. And so that's even going to go up higher when we get to Unearthed Arcana, but we're not there yet. So I rolled these dice and I used a die roller, like an online one. And I came up with the character having a strength of 15, an intelligence of 9 exactly, a wisdom of 18, interestingly enough, a dexterity of 15, a constitution of 11, and a charisma of 17. So those were all rolled. Again, I did them as a package, all 6 at a time, and it took me 4 times until I qualified to get this paladin. And randomly, it gave me a 17 and an 18 in the same stat array, which was very, very interesting. Okay, so then you see, we see here for the hit dice in Greyhawk, technically, the hit die for a paladin would be a d6 because it's d6 for every character. Now, there is an optional rule presented in Greyhawk for the first time, which is that there is an optional system presented for variable hit dice by class. So it bumps fighters up to D8, magic users down to D4, and then thieves start at D4 because they're introduced in here. And then clerics are left at D6. So, and that's also the first time you're going to see variable weapon damage as an option. So there are optional rules. So that's why I put that the average hit point for a starting level paladin is going to be 3.5, and then I put an asterisk because 3.5 is the average of a d6, but it could also be 4.5 if you were going to bump them up and use the optional variable hit die. So it would be d8 hit die. They wouldn't get a con bonus because their constitution is too low, and it's at 11. So I did roll starting gold for them. I rolled 3d6 and I got 11, and then I multiplied it by 10 to get 110 gold pieces, which means they do have enough to afford a suit of plate mail and shield, which would cost a total of 60, 50 for the plate and 10 for the shield. So that would give them armor class 2. And then they're going to get an AC bonus from their dexterity of 15 of 1. So that would mean that their armor class would be 1, because remember, this is descending armor class, lower is better. Okay, now their ranged attack bonus is also going to be a 1 from their dexterity. Their sword damage would be 3.5 because it's d6, or if you use variable weapon damage, it would be 4.5. And then again, they don't get any spells. Now their charisma is going to allow them to have up to 6 hirelings maximum, and the loyalty base of those hirelings is going to be at +2 because of their high charisma. So those are really kind of like the main things that we're looking at here in Greyhawk. Just a quick reminder that I have started a Patreon, and I did that because you, the fans and subscribers of the channel, actually asked me to start one so that you could find a different way to support me. So, and I'm trying to make it as cool as I can by giving you really interesting, fun content. So I've already released, and I just started it back in September. Today is, remember, the 5th of November. If anybody knows that old poem. But I've already released 2 adventures. So these are custom adventures. The first one was called The Bone Mill, and it was designed as like a 4-page folder with the maps and some tables and things, and then custom artwork by my friend Bill Green, who also did the map and the layout, and then he did the artwork, as you see here. And then the second one was really, now this was a draft copy. I don't have a printed out full copy yet, but what's called the Skull. So there was the map. It looked different when it was finalized, but this is sort of like a Romanian folklore thing about a school of magic run by these like weather wizards. And they actually, it turns out that the head of the school is essentially like in Romanian folklore, it's the devil. I didn't use the devil here. I called it the nameless patron. But it's got factions. It's got random tables for like different names, adventure hooks, and there's some cool traps in here. There's like brand new monsters. I have a wandering monster table for both on the way to the school and then one within the school that both have custom monsters in them, and lots of ideas. So that's the kind of content I'm putting out. This one ended up being 6 pages. As you see, this Bone Mill one was 4, but I also put out other tables and ideas throughout the month. And then I have done custom polls to talk about future content for the YouTube channel. And I released like a 13-page conversion guide for my Mask of the Red Death video, where I converted the classes, the kits, the magic system, and the firearms system from Mask of the Red Death, which was created for 2nd edition advanced D&D, over to old school essentials. And that's all stuff that you can get at my Patreon as soon as you join at the $5 a month level as the torchbearer, and then you get access to all that previous content. So I hope you check it out. I have a lot of fun creating the content, and I'm getting a lot of good feedback from folks. So there is a link below. It's just patreon.com/daddyroll1. And thanks so much for your support. Now, in basic D&D, the basic D&D line, which I'm using as a kind of a catch-all term to mean the Holmes edition from 1977, the Moldvay Cook Marsh or BX edition from 1981, and then the BECMI edition from 1983. They're all kind of related. Obviously, BX and BECMI are much more closely related than Holmes. But this is going to be pretty quick because there are no paladins in the Holmes edition or in the BX edition. Now, Holmes does mention very briefly that if you are looking for expanded character types, that you can refer to Advanced Dungeons and Dragons, because in there you will find paladins and rangers as a form of fighter. And it also talks about illusionists and druids and things like that. So that's the only mention that we're going to get of paladins in the Holmes basic set. And then in BX, they're not mentioned at all. So the first time we're going to see paladins then in this line is going to come in the companion set of the BECMI edition, which, if you're new to studying this, BECMI stands for Basic, Expert, Companion, Masters, and Immortals. And each one of those different sets, those letters for those sets, refers to what level you're speaking of. So Basic was levels 1 through 3, Expert levels 4 through 14, and then the companion set that comes out in 1984 was levels 15 through 25. Now, in here, we're going to see in this section on player character types, we get to the fighter. So here at our fighter table, we see an interesting section here over on the right-hand side, and it says becoming a landowner. And it says most Dominion-owned territory rulers are fighters. The art of fighting is a mercenary skill in the D&D world, and professional fighters generally survive longer than other people. As a landowner, fighters are less restricted than other classes. They may retain independence. They may remain independent or swear fealty to another ruler. Your DM will tell you what system of government is used in his campaign and what the characters must do to obtain land and rule a dominion. And then it says traveling. And then it says the alignment of a wandering fighter determines his or her title, special abilities, and so forth. A lawful wandering fighter may be known as a paladin if he meets the following requirements. Otherwise, he may be a knight. So this is now in the BECMI edition, the companion set here. The paladin is not something that you start out as. It's something that you're going to aspire to attain, essentially, at what they're going to say is name level, which is 9th. At 9th level, a fighter's level title becomes Lord. And at that point, if you are a wandering or traveling fighter and you are lawful, wandering meaning you're not being settled down to a specific dominion, then you can choose, again, if you're lawful, to become a paladin. So you have to swear a fealty and oath of service to a lawful church to gain paladin status. You must be, again, it says name level or greater to be accepted by the church. And thereafter, the paladin may be summoned by the church's leaders at any time and must do as they command as long as service aids the powers of good. And then it says the paladin can detect evil as the cleric spell up to once per round simply by concentrating. If the paladin's wisdom score is 13 or greater, the character can cast cleric spells as if a cleric of 1/3 the level of the fighter rounded down. And if the wisdom score is 12 or less, the fighter can still be a paladin but cannot cast spells. So that's a bit of a difference that we've seen before. Usually it's all or nothing, but in this case, it's all dependent on the wisdom. And then it says the paladin learns how to meditate and cast spells from the cleric of the church. The clerics will refuse any offer of compensation or payment for this service. So the paladin's being taught how to do this by a cleric, so it implies that they're casting spells as a cleric. The paladin can turn undead as if a cleric of 1/3 the level of the fighter rounded down. And then it says the paladin may only travel with a number of hirelings equal to no more than his clerical level. And his clerical level, again, is basically going to be based on 1/3 of his fighter level. And then it says the paladin must assist anyone who asks for help, with 2 exceptions. Evil need not be aided, and the paladin is on a mission for a higher authority, such as by a quest or serving a duke, etc. Then only a small amount of help need be given along with an explanation. And then it says assistance never involves donations of money or items, but only service for a short time. So that is it. That is the paladin in the BECMI edition of D&D. So again, it's really interesting. It's sort of like if you're familiar with the third edition terminology and mechanics, it's almost like a prestige class. You hit a certain level, and then if you meet the requirements, you get these extra goodies on top of your fighter abilities. So, you've got this code of conduct, you've got the clerical spell access, and the turning undead and things like that. And it is now, I think it's different. This is very different from the Greyhawk version because it's framed more as like a reward versus like a starting archetype. So I think that's kind of an interesting little take on it. And it's going to be very similar, but we're going to see this in the Rules Cyclopedia, which is sort of like the condensed one book volume of the BECM parts of BECMI. It just doesn't include the Immortals set. So that is the companion Paladin for BECMI from 1984. Okay, so what we saw really in original D&D and the Greyhawk supplement is the Paladin is not just a class, it's more of like a moral challenge for the character, but also for the player to play the character correctly so that you don't lose your Paladin stats. But then you see in the BECMI line, it's really treated as more of like a it's like a reward. It's something that you aspire to, and you don't gain it at first level. Okay, but now we're going to go back to a subclass version here in Advanced D&D First Edition, and this is really going to be a major expansion to the class. So this is my original Player's Handbook from 1978, and we're going to see a few things in here, but let's start by looking at these tables here to see what types of the racial stock of the character can qualify as a paladin. So we're going to be looking at this line here. It says LG, which means they have to be lawful good. So that's a change because this AD&D system is going to introduce the familiar 9-point alignment system, where you have the different axes of law, chaos, and neutrality on one axis, and then you have good, neutrality, and evil on the other one. So lawful good only. And you see that a paladin can only be played by humans. So they've removed that kind of thing that they had in the Greyhawk supplement, where other fighting men, if they were lawful, of like, whether they were dwarf, hobbit, or elf, could be paladins. And then we see over here the racial limits, and humans, of course, are unlimited for everything. So, that's pretty standard there. Okay, so let's talk about how the class is then described in here. So we see this table where it goes over the hit die 10, maximum number hit die 9, spell ability yes, and then class level limit none. Okay, and then the spell ability, it says clerical spell ability up to 4th level spells first gained at 9th level. So I'll put all that on my little chart later so it's easy to compare. And then we get our weapons and armor down here. So we see paladins can wear any armor, can use any shield, and carry any weapons. And then the little asterisks there are just about like if you're short, you can't use certain weapons. And then it says oil they can use, but poison never. All right. So now we're going to finally get to our description of the paladin, which is going to come here after the fighter. So you see here's the fighter, and then we see here's the paladin at the bottom of the page. Apologies if you're listening and not watching, but we are going to look at this gorgeous artwork here by David C. Sutherland III. See his signature there. And this is a famous drawing illustration called A Paladin in Hell. And so we see our paladin here fighting some, if he's in hell, he's fighting devils, right? So here's our description of the paladin. I'm not going to read all of this, but it says the paladin character is a fighter subclass, but unlike normal fighters, all paladins must begin as lawful good and always remain lawful good or absolutely lose all special powers which are given to them. They have both fighting abilities and limited spell. Okay, it says to become a paladin, a character must be human, have a strength of not less than 12, minimum intelligence 9, wisdom 13, minimum constitution 9, and not less than 17 charisma. So the only ability score that doesn't have a minimum requirement is dexterity for a paladin, at least for now. That's going to change. All right, and then it basically talks about if you have both strength and wisdom in excess of 15, then you gain the benefits of adding 10% to your XP awarded by the Dungeon Master. Law and good deeds are the meat and drink of paladins. If they ever knowingly perform an act which is chaotic in nature, they can seek out a high-level cleric, 7th level or above, of lawful good alignment, confess their sin, and do penance as prescribed, so they can atone. However, if they ever knowingly perform an evil act, they're immediately stripped of their paladin status and they can never gain it back. So at least with chaos now, you have a chance to atone, but an evil act, you're done. You just become a fighter. Okay, paying extra XP, I guess. Okay, so then it gives you the benefits. You get detect evil at up to 60 feet of distance. Which you just have to concentrate on. Make all saving throws at +2. So this is going to be consistent. Immunity to all forms of disease. Laying on hands is going to be very consistent. And then curing disease is going to change from once per day to once per week. And you're going to gain ability to cure more diseases every 5 levels. They continually emanate a protection from evil in a 1-inch radius around the paladin. Furthermore, at 3rd level, they gain the power to affect undead. So here's where we're going to see the turn undead show up as a cleric of 2 levels lower. So a third level paladin turns undead as a 1st level cleric. 4th level or anytime thereafter, they can call their warhorse, very similar to what we saw in Greyhawk, except in Greyhawk, you could do it at 1st level. Here, you have to be 4th level, but that if your warhorse dies, that thing of you can't get another one for 10 years, that's still going to be in here in AD&D. The paladin has a holy sword. And it says, your referee will explain it to you. You project a circle of power 1 inch in diameter when the holy sword is unsheathed and held. And this power dispels magic as the spell at the level of magic use equal to the experience level of the paladin. So a 9th level paladin would dispel magic as a 9th level magic user, as an example. At 9th level through 20th level, you gain the ability to employ cleric spells. They may never use scrolls of spells, however, except those normally usable by fire. So that's a weird restriction, and I'm actually not sure why Gary did that. That's a really strange restriction. The weapon and magic item restrictions are going to be exactly the same as we saw in Greyhawk. So pseudo armor, shield, 4 weapons, 4 other items. Okay, and then it's going to tell you that you have to donate your excess wealth. Okay, it says they never retain it, keeping only sufficient to support themselves in a modest manner, pay henchmen, men-at-arms, and servitors, or to construct and maintain a small castle. The DM will give you details of this as necessary. Excess is giving away, as is the tithe, 10% of all income, be it treasure, wages, or whatever, given to whatever charitable religious institution, not a clerical player character, of lawful good alignment the paladin selects. And it says they will only have henchmen of lawful good alignment and none other, and they will only associate with characters and creatures of good alignment. They can join a company of adventurers which contains non-evil neutrals only on a single expedition basis, and only a sum of which will further the cause of lawful good as purposed. If possible, they will take service or form an alliance with lawful good characters, whether players or not, who are clerics or fighters of noble status. So that's interesting, that noble status line. So that's going to come up again here in a minute. But this is the first that we're really kind of we're seeing this connection with a nobility or aristocracy. And again, if we remember the word paladin coming from comes palatinus, those were the essentially aristocratic fighters. They were imperial officers in the emperor's court. That would indicate some level of aristocratic status. And so it's interesting that we're seeing that come up here, because we didn't see that come up in Greyhawk. I think it's implied, but it's not stated. Here it's stated outright. They do not attract a body of men-at-arms to service as do regular fighters. And then you see here our table of experience point table, and you see that's going to take us 2,751 experience points to get to level 2, whereas a fighter is going to take 2,001. So much higher experience point basis, and that's to compensate for all of the extra abilities that you're getting as a paladin. Okay, so that's kind of the paladin in first edition. Now, very interestingly, I think that, you've got this kind of player psychology of the prestige of being a paladin. If you were able to roll those stats, like I talked about how difficult that was for me trying to qualify when I was rolling it for this video. But then also you've got this paranoia that, the DM might be out to get you if you slip up. Now, a lot of players didn't play that way, but if you're playing a paladin and you're getting all those extra abilities, part of the restriction of playing a paladin is that you have to follow these lawful good, deeds, and not doing so removes your paladin status. And that is part of the way that screwing up can kind of affect you. Okay, so now one of the other things that's going to happen is in the Dungeon Master's Guide, there's a section in here on spells. And it says character spells, day-to-day acquisition of cleric spells. And it goes all the way through, and it talks about how clerics have to, have his or her deity picked out so that they pray to that deity to get those spells, and then the deity awards them. And then it says over here, note that the above applies to paladins with respect to their clerical spell powers and to rangers with respect to their druidic clerical spell powers. So this now does indicate in the Dungeon Master's Guide, it's buried in one sentence at the bottom of a paragraph of a section, but it specifically says that everything that it says as far as how a cleric gets their spells, which in Advanced D&D First Edition, it is very clear that a cleric gets their spells from a deity. They pray to the deity awards them the spells. Okay, and if they have some kind of falling out with the deity is not going to reward them, right? Give them the spells. And then it says, well, the paladins do it the same way. So that does imply then that the paladin would need to have some kind of lawful good deity that they're praying to, or as Gary said, a pantheon of lawful good deities to award the spells that they need. But that was never in Greyhawk. So Gary thought it seems pretty clear, but he didn't go out of his way to articulate it that way. But he does here, again, buried in a section in the Dungeon Master's Guide. So that's really first edition. Now let's look at our chart here. I've kind of talked about all this already, but just for some comparative purposes. So we see that in AD&D, our hit die average has gone up to 5.5 because we're using a D10. Our Constitution bonus is going to stay at 0. Our plate, mail, and shield is still going to give us an AC of 2. On our Dexterity of 15 is going to give us a bonus of 1, which means our AC would drop to 1. Now, what's really interesting in AD&D is that the ability scores, the bonuses and penalties that they give for different categories of things are not consistent. So as an example, a 15 Dex gives you a bonus of 1, or really -1 to your AC. However, it does not give you a bonus to your ranged attacks. Gary just did it that way. It's the only edition that really does that, where there's differences. But anyway, he's not going to get a bonus. This character's not going to get a bonus to ranged attacks. Their sword's going to do 4.5 points of damage, assuming it's a long sword. Okay, that's the kind of sword I'm going to assume. And they're not going to get a melee bonus to hit from their strength. Their strength is 15, and they're not going to get a bonus from that either. They gain spells at 9th level, and the highest level spell they can cast is 4th. They get a bonus of 4 to their saving throws, and that's coming from their wisdom. And then there's another +2 added on top of that. The wisdom is only going to apply to magical saves. And then the +2 bonus from paladin status is going to be to any kind of saving throw. Okay, and then they can have a maximum of 10 hirelings with a charisma of 18, and they can get those hirelings have a +30% bonus to their loyalty score. Okay, and that's also going to be the reaction bonus that a paladin gets. Reactions in AD&D are based on a percentage instead of on a 2d6 table. All right, so that's first edition Advanced Dungeons and Dragons. Okay, now, very special time. This is going to be the giveaway that I announced in my video on Mask of the Red Death that I went through as part of my October horror video collection, my theme for the month. And in that video, I mentioned that I was going to be doing a giveaway of the 1978 Trampier cover of the Player's Handbook, which was a generous donation to me from Jason at Charlemagne. He had an extra copy and specifically said that he was giving it to me with the thought that I could use it as a giveaway on my channel, which was very awesome of him. And so thank you to Jason from Charlemagne. Check out Charlemagne at SHADOMAIN.com. Tons of great content there for old school and new school role-playing games, and like interviews and just all kinds of stuff, content, etc. So I'm going to be doing the giveaway here. So I was very specific in my instructions for how you had to do this. And I said, you can't just read what people are doing in the comments and copy that. You have to follow specifically what I said, which was use the secret phrase. And then you had to contact me either through email or through Facebook Messenger or Instagram Messenger or however you wanted to contact me. If you were a patron, you could do it on Patreon, whatever, so that I had your contact info. Because the last time I did a giveaway, I had to do it 3 times before I finally got a winner. Actually, 4 times, because people kept just putting in the comments. That must be bots or something. And I wrote and said, you won the thing, and they didn't get back to me. So this time I wanted to make sure I had the contact info. So the contact info is hidden here in this little grouped column up here. But these are the names of people that entered, their YouTube handles. And I got 69 entries that actually did what they were supposed to, qualified entries, I should say, that you see them here. And then I had 15 people who put comments down and then but didn't contact me. And I even commented and said, don't forget the second part of the instructions. And those 15 people never followed up. So Unfortunately, they wouldn't be entered. So if you thought that you entered and don't see your name listed here, that would be why. Go back and check your comments, and you'll see I replied to you. So in any event, I had 69 people. So I'm going to ask my device over here to pick a number between 3 and 71, I believe it is. Yes, 71. Now, somebody last time I did this said, oh, but if you say pick a number between 3 and 71, doesn't that mean that the 3 and 71 won't be picked? And I tried it out. I tested it. So just to make sure, Alexa, pick a number between 1 and 4.
Here's a number between 1 and 4. It's 4.
Okay, so I asked it to pick a number between 1 and 4, and you heard, hopefully you could hear that. It said 4. Okay, so you know that it's going to pick up like both like the starting number and the final number. Okay, Alexa, pick a number between 3 and 71.
Here's a number between 3 and 71. It's 19.
No, 19. Okay, it is Harrison Lynch, 4701. So congratulations to Harrison Lynch. You have won the 1978 Player's Handbook. So I will contact you via email, or if you get to me first and do that, then I will follow up with you and get that off in the mail to you. Okay. So thank you so much to everybody who entered and who followed the instructions. Also, let me know. There a lot of people seemed confused about the instructions. I thought it was pretty clear, but some people weren't really sure. I would love an easier way to do this. I just want a way that doesn't make it so that like I have to do a lot of extra work to try to track people down when they win. So, I'll try to do something different next time. But if you have a suggestion of a better way to do it, that helps me so that I have people's contact info. I'm all ears. Just let me know. You can put that in the comments below. Or if you entered and sent me an email or a Facebook or Instagram message, you can contact me that way. But I do want to thank everybody who entered. I do have some extra goodies that I will be giving away in a future video. My friend Charlie Puzo, I've talked about him here on the channel before, gave me some copies of Dragon magazines that he had. So I think he gave me 3 or 4 issues. And fortunately for you, all of the ones that he gave me are ones that I already own. So I will be using those as a giveaway here on the channel, and I'll probably do it in my next time I cover Dragon magazine, like one of my, Dragon magazine issue by issue series. So the next time I do that, I'll probably be giving away some copies of Dragon magazine. So that's a great way to get your hands on some old school content. So be on the lookout for that. Thank you again for entering the contest. Okay, now let's continue with first edition AD&D, but this is first edition with the Unearthed Arcana book from 1985. Now, I have a whole video about this book, but it is generally considered, I would say, one of the more polarizing books in the history of Dungeons & Dragons, specifically in Advanced Dungeons & Dragons first edition, and see that whole video that I made about it if you want to learn more about why that is. So I'm not going to get into why this book was put together or anything like that. What we are going to talk about, however, is we're going to start with this table, which you see the character classes have been expanded here. And we note something very interesting. This is the racial stock of character table. And we see that Paladin is no longer under fighter. It is now under something called a cavalier. And we will talk about that in a second. However, what I want to point out here is as we go through the Paladin line, we get all the way to half-elves, and we see that half-elves can now be paladins. That's new. That was not in first edition. First edition AD&D Player's Handbook says human only, but now this says paladins maybe, or half-elves may be a paladin, as well as humans. Now, it's only half-elves and humans, so it's still very restrictive. So we see our table here of hit die type, die 10 for cavaliers and paladins. There is a little footnote, though. Maximum number, cavaliers get 10, however, half-elves only get, or paladins only get 9. And then spell ability, we see yes, class level limit none. Yes for paladins, not for cavaliers. Now, let's look at this table. Well, first off, it says a Cavalier and Paladin have a hit point range of 4 to 13 points at first level, generated by either 3d4 plus 1 or 1d10 plus 3, depending on the social standing of the character at the start of his or her career, which is interesting. So that's a difference that we're going to see pop up in here. Then it's going to talk about weapons, and it says armor any, and then there's an asterisk or like a little footnote thing. And then it says weapons any. And then it says oil no. Now before it said oil yes for paladin, but now it's going to say no. and then poison never. All right, so what are these notes? It says, for number one, it says, a cavalier or paladin will not wear leather, padded, or studded leather armor because such garb is beneath the character's station. Similarly, a cavalier or a paladin will not use polearms, missile weapons, or other types of arms that are commonly associated with the lower social classes. And then it says, see the description of the cavalier hereafter for details. And then it says, the use of oil in personal combat is unacceptable to the cavalier and the paladin, but such characters may use oil in siege warfare. So we're starting to see some restrictions here based on the social class of the character, and now we're going to get the depiction of the cavalier class. So the cavalier did debut in a Dragon Magazine article, number 72. It was my second issue of Dragon Magazine that I ever got. And it's going to be repeated here almost exactly word for word. I don't really think they changed a single thing. They just relayed it out with some new artwork. So because the paladin is now going to be a subclass of cavalier, we're going to have to spend a little time going over what is a cavalier. And it essentially says that they are they're mounted warriors. So now what's interesting, it says a cavalier must have minimum ability scores of 15 each in strength, dexterity, and constitution, and scores of 10 in intelligence and a 10 in wisdom. They do not have a charisma minimum, but everything else is either 15 or 10 for wisdom and intelligence. And it says they initially must be of good alignment, but they can be chaotic, neutral, or lawful. And they attack and make saving throws as a fighter, but they get additional abilities. Okay, and so they cannot gain the benefits of weapon specialization. However, that's kind of irrelevant because they get something else that's just as good, if not better. So it says, in order to become a cavalier, a character must be in service to some deity, noble, order, or special cause. The DM will determine if this requirement can be met within the limits of the campaign and if it is properly met by the cavalier character. They must always place honor, bravery, and personal deeds in the forefront of his or her activity and must adhere to a code of chivalry, which is described below. This section, by the way, on the cavalier, it's very, very long. So I'm not going to be able to read all of this, of course, but it says a cavalier must be a proper social class and is usually of noble or aristocratic origin. So it goes through all this, and essentially what this is going to tell you is that if you are not quite at the social standing that you need to be, but you're close, you get to start out as a 0 level character with negative experience points. So you would be a horseman at level 0, the first one, and then you would roll 1d4 plus 1 hit points. Okay, and then you would move to the second negative level, which is called a lancer. And then you'd have 2d4 plus 1 hit points. And then you finally would become a first level armiger. And at that point, you would get your full hit die plus 3 hit points at first level. So that's where, it's a little wonky that it's described here, but this is the only class that's going to do that, where you have to start out at negative experience points if you don't have the correct social birth standing. Okay, so that's what that whole paragraph is. And it says humans, elves, and half-elves may become cavaliers. However, the members of the latter two races cannot qualify unless they are of gray, dark, or high elf stock, or for half-elves descended from such stock. So if you are a half, wood elf, nope, you can't. But if you are a half dark elf, half gray elf, or half high elf, you can qualify to be a paladin and also as a cavalier. And then it says they're not limited to the weapons they can use. And we kind of talked about this. It says certain weapons are preferred over others, so they will seek proficiency in those weapons before learning others. Those are the lance, which is required at first level, the long sword, the broadsword, the bastard sword, short sword, horseman's mace, horseman's flail, horseman's military pick, dagger, scimitar, and javelin. And then once you've learned all of those, if you want to learn something else, have at it. But you have to do all those other ones first. And then it says, in addition, elven and half-elven cavaliers will prefer to use a short composite bow. All right, so weapons that deal out damage at a distance, including polearms, missile weapons, and two-handed sword, call into question the cavalier's personal bravery, and as such are avoided by all except the most powerful cavaliers. So that's an issue that you have to take up because you might be violating your chivalric code. So then you gain bonuses to hit with certain weapons. It's a real pain, but basically you're +1 to hit with the lance at first level if you use it while mounted, and then that's going to increase at 7th level and then at 13th level. And then at 3rd level, you're +1 to hit with either a broadsword, longsword, or scimitar, player choice. And then that will increase to +2 at, at 11th level? No, at ninth level, sorry. And then at 5th level, you're +1 to hit with either the Horseman's Mace, Horseman's Flail, or Horseman's Military Pick. And that is going to increase to +2 at 11th level. So ultimately, you can be, that pattern follows. So as you keep going up, that +1 increase by every so many levels is going to go up, but in these categories of first lance, then sword, then horseman weapon, essentially. Okay, so that's one of the things that you get. And then it says, it doesn't apply to damage, and it doesn't mean you can hit a creature that can only be hit by magical weapons. But those are essentially like your weapons of choice, is what they're called. Okay, so it says, and you have to keep the same one. So if you picked longsword at level 3 to get your +1 bonus, then when you get to like level 9, you can't then pick scimitar to get a +2 bonus. You have to keep the longsword to get the +2. And then it says you can make multiple attacks with the weapon of choice as if you were 5 levels higher than actual as far as attacks per round are concerned, which is, for example, a 3rd level cavalier can attack 3 times every 2 rounds with a weapon of choice, as opposed to 1 attack 1 round with another ordinary weapon. And then at 16th level and above, you can attack 3 times per round with the weapon of your weapon of choice. So that's a huge deal. And then on top of that, your lance is your preferred weapon, and so you get a bonus to damage when using the lance while mounted, equal to your character level, your bonus to damage. So at 5th level, +5 damage to your lance if you're mounted. You get a +1 flat bonus if you're using a lance unmounted. Okay, and then it says you can parry, and there's all this kind of stuff. And, again, I'm not trying to get into this because this isn't intended to describe the cavalier. But then it says armor is as much a badge of station as is a means of protection. And so it basically says there's an order to which certain armors are better than others. And, what you really want is plate armor. And then after that would be field plate. And then after that is plate mail, then banded, then splint mail, then chain mail, then scale mail, then ring mail. And it says they won't wear leather, studded leather, or padded, because it's the dress of thieves and peasants. And it says this even applies to magical armor. So chainmail +2, you would get rid of that if you could find banded or splint mail that wasn't magic, even though the chainmail +2 would give you a better armor class bonus, because the status of wearing banded or splint mail is higher than that of wearing chainmail. So again, kind of a social hindrance to a cavalier. And then it talks about mounted combat. So when you are mounted, you make all attacks as if your character were 1 level higher than you actually are. And then you're born bred to the saddle, so there's a very little chance you're going to fall out of the saddle. And then it gives you all these tricks you can do. You can vault into the saddle. A female elven cavalier at level 4, and it says, and only a female elf can take a unicorn as a steed. But they're the only kind of cavalier that can do that. And then you can urge your steed to greater speeds. You can fly and handle a Pegasus at level 7. At level 9, you can handle and ride a Hippogriff. And then at level 11, you can ride a Griffin or similar creature. It says the mount will be friendly, that kind of thing. They have a high knowledge of horses. So their horses are going to have more hit points because you pick out the best horse available. You're always practicing with arms to get better at attacking. And so you get to roll percentile to your physical ability score, strength, dexterity, and constitution. Just like a fighter rolls exceptional strength, you're rolling it, but for all of them, and you don't have to have an 18. So if you had a 15 in those, you're going to roll percentile at each level when you go up in level. And once you pass 100, that ability score goes up by 1 point. So they talk about, like, if you had a 89% or whatever in one of your abilities, and then you rolled, like, say 25% at your next level, you've gone over 100. And so that ability score would go up to 16. And then the leftover percentage points would just be added for you to add on to next time. So that's crazy. And you can go up as high as 18 in all 3 of those ability scores as you roll them. So other characters don't do that. So I think that's very interesting, because even the fighter, the exceptional strength, you roll it at first level if you qualify, but that's it. You don't keep rolling it. Okay, so it talks about all how to do that, and it talks about training, and then it talks about saving throws, but they have a radiated protection from fear aura around them to allied creatures. and then they're immune to certain effects, or like 90% immune, like beguiling, charm, domination, hold, hypnosis, magic jar, all this kind of stuff. Okay, so why am I talking about the Cavalier here? I mean, it is important, but we're going to keep going. They have to be of good alignment. It talks about them functioning at negative hit points, which is a big deal in AD&D. Member of the upper social classes, they can expect full hospitality, food, lodging, and whatever else is needed. They follow a moral code, and then it says, so they have to serve someone or some cause. Knightly virtues are liberality, glory, courtesy, honor, unselfishness, bravery, good faith, and pride. And then it says the code for a feudal campaign can be summed up as follows. I'm not going to read this. I would encourage you to just freeze it here if you're listening and not watching, so you can see this table later. But it basically gives you a code of chivalry. So you have to follow that code. And then if you don't follow it, the DM is going to penalize you, reduce your experience points and things like that. So then it says, and as a result of the code and desire for battle, cavaliers cannot be controlled in battle situations. They will charge any enemy in sight with the following order of preference. First, they're going to charge powerful monsters like dragons, demons, giants, etc., serving enemy leaders, and then the leaders themselves. Then they're going to charge opponent cavaliers of great renown, enemy flags and standards. Third, opponent cavalry of noble or elite status. 4, other opponent cavalry. 5, elite footmen. 6, opponent camp and headquarters. 7, opponent melee troops. And last, levies and peasants. Now, remember that order that we saw in chainmail. So that is directly relevant to the Cavalier, and it's very, very similar. I mean, the categories are different, but the idea that there's certain characters that you're going to attack first, partially just for the prestige of attacking that character. And like, you're of noble status, you're not going to go ride down a bunch of peasants. You're going to go for the strongest thing on the field because that's what you're expected to do, and because it gets you more glory. Okay, so it talks about being of good alignment and that kind of thing. Now, why did I go through all that when we're talking about the Paladin? Because of this, the Paladin. The Paladin is no longer considered to be a subclass of the fighter, but is a subclass of the Cavalier. A Paladin must have all the requisite ability scores of the Cavalier, plus a wisdom score of at least 13 and a charisma score of 17 or higher. Paladins are still devoted to the cause of the lawful good alignment and will follow those deities and orders that profess that alignment. Should a paladin stray from that alignment, he or she will become a cavalier and be stripped of all special paladin powers. Paladins must initially be of the correct social station or be sponsored by local nobility. In the latter case, they can go through the horsemen and lancers 0 levels before gaining paladin abilities. As a subclass of the cavalier, they no longer have a prime requisite ability, and they don't gain experience points bonus for exceptional ability scores. And then it says, the powers, abilities, and level advancement of the paladin as described in the player's handbook remain unchanged. In addition, the paladin gains the abilities and powers of the cavalier class, including weapon of choice, parrying ability, horsemanship, saving throw bonuses, and immunity to fear. They can also increase his or her charisma score in the same way that he or she, as a cavalier, can increase strength, dexterity, and constitution. So that's massive. You are gaining a ton of abilities as a cavalier that you just saw. That's why I went through all that, because I wanted you to understand all the things that you're going to gain. And you get to keep all of your paladin abilities, and you get to raise your ability scores as you go up in level by rolling percentile die. The downside, quote unquote, is that now you have to have a minimum 15 strength, dexterity, and constitution. Before you needed a 12 strength, 9 constitution, and there was no dex requirement. Now you have to have a 15 in each. And you have to have a 13 wisdom and a 10 intelligence and a 17 charisma. Darn near impossible to do that without cheating. Now, there are some new methods in this book given for generating ability scores. I've talked about those before in other videos. So there are some that are extremely generous, but still, even using one of those things without cheating, it's almost impossible to qualify to become a cavalier or a paladin in this version in Unearthed Arcana. It's insane. It's crazy. And this is why a lot of people don't like this book. Cavaliers are extremely overpowered. They're very difficult to qualify for, but their combat abilities are far and above better than any other class. And then the paladin gets all of that plus all their paladin abilities. They become nigh unstoppable. Okay, so, but other things that we're seeing in here, the return of this social status idea for the paladin, that's a huge change, because it's really turning them back to this, like, you know, nobility and this aristocratic ideal that didn't necessarily show up in Greyhawk. We see it a tiny bit when it mentions it in that throwaway line in the player's handbook, the first edition player's handbook, but it really comes to the forefront here where your paladin is now an aristocratic or a noble. Okay, so and there's tables that they talk about, like rolling to figure out your birthright is all throughout here. So that can create some tension if you have players that don't want to be seen as part of the nobility, because the paladin is essentially, that's what they've become here. So, and Gygax talks many times about playing knights properly. That's what he sees cavaliers and paladins as these like knights of heroic chivalrous virtue. And, it kind of changes it back and makes the paladin a lot more like, quote unquote medieval. It makes them a lot more like the Arthurian section that's in here, Deities and Demigods from 1980, the Arthurian heroes, where they talk about like how King Arthur is a paladin and Galahad is a paladin, Sir Galahad. And so it's really connecting up more with that than with, I would say, even with like the Charlemagne paladins that Gary said were the inspiration for the class. So I think that, that's a change in the flavor of the paladin class, making them much more medieval and also much more restrictive, how difficult it is to qualify. But that's our look at Unearthed Arcana and the paladin changes that came in first edition. It's a lot, as you see. All right, and let's look at second edition Advanced Dungeons and Dragons. This is from 1989, and check to see how the paladin is depicted in here. So by and large, second edition is very, very close to first edition, like across the board. I'm not just for paladins, but for everything. So one of the things that's going to happen, as we've talked about before in second edition, is that it's going to create these sort of groups of classes. So there are four. There's the warrior group, the rogue group, the wizard group, and the priest group. And paladins are going to fall within the warrior group. So the warrior group first is going to talk about the fighter, but it's also going to show us the experience levels. And what we see here is that the experience point value to rise to second levels of paladin is going to be reduced. So you remember in first edition, it was 2,751 experience points needed to get to second level. That's going to be reduced to 2,250. Same as the ranger. The fighter only needs 2,000. So it's going to go through and explain the fighter first, makes sense. And then we're going to get to our description of the paladin. And we see the requirements here, which are similar, but not exactly the same as first edition. So strength 12 is the same. Constitution 9 is the same as first edition pre-Unearthed Arcana. Wisdom 13, Charisma 17. Those both were the same. So the other thing that was different in first edition was that you needed a intelligence of 9, and that has been stripped out of the requirements here. So you'll notice that Paladin is now kind of lumped back in with Fighter. That's because the Cavalier class was removed from second edition. So we're going kind of backwards to going back to where the Paladin is a subclass, so to speak, of Fighter. And then it has this little description here. It says the paladin is a noble and heroic warrior. So we're getting back that noble aspect again. The symbol of all that is right and true in the world. As such, he has high ideals he must maintain. Talks about the Roland and the 12 peers of Charlemagne. Also talks about Lancelot, Sir Gawain, and Sir Galahad are all examples. But it says, however, many brave and heroic soldiers have tried and failed to live up to the ideals of the paladin. It is not an easy task. And then it says only humans can become paladins. So now we're going backwards again. We're removing how in Unearthed Arcana it said half-elves could be paladins. Talks about the minimum requirements again, and then it says they also have to be lawful good, which is pretty consistent throughout Dungeons and Dragons. There was no lawful good in original D&D, but lawful was sort of the encapsulated both. And then in every other edition, in like advanced, it's always been lawful good. And you get, an increase in experience points of 10% if your strength and charisma scores are both 16 or more. And then it says lawfulness and good deeds are the meat and drink of the paladin. That's almost copied and pasted from the first edition player's handbook. And then if you ever knowingly perform a chaotic act, the same thing as we saw before, right? So you can atone for chaotic, but not for evil. All right. And then it's going to go through the abilities, and these are pretty much going to be the exact same thing that we saw in first edition. So with the exception of the slight changes in the ability score requirements and and then the change in the experience points values. By and large, the second edition Paladin is very, very similar, or pretty much almost identical, you would say, to the first edition pre-Unearthed Arcana AD&D Paladin. Okay, so you see all the descriptions here. Again, apologies if you're listening and not watching, but I'm just kind of doing some quick looks here at the pages. So the same thing about they don't attract a body of followers. You've got a tithe. You may only employ lawful good henchmen, etc. So I know that was quick, but that was second edition. We'll just put our chart up here for comparison purposes, but everything is pretty much going to be very consistent with what we saw, like I said, in first edition Advanced Dungeons and Dragons. So now, another thing that's going to happen in second edition is the release of the complete Paladin's Handbook. And this is interestingly, although Paladin's the class that I quite liked back in the day, this is one of the few of the Brown Players Resource handbooks that I don't own in like a physical copy. I do own it as a PDF. So we'll go over to the laptop and we'll look at the complete Paladin's Handbook very, very briefly just to kind of talk about it. So very quickly, I wanted to look at the complete Paladin's Handbook. So this is released later in second edition history. It's around 1994. This is by Rick Swan, who wrote one of my favorite of these Player's Handbook Rules Supplement series, the Complete Wizard's Handbook, which was one of the first ones. This is now going to be one of the later ones. And as I mentioned, it's one of the few in this series that I don't own. And it's really nothing against Rick. This one is really more full of flavor text, or what we would now call fluff, which is fun to read. But as I read through it, it just seemed like something I really didn't need, because a lot of this stuff was stuff that I was creating on my own for my own home campaign. So it gets into things like the roots of the Paladin, which is interesting. It talks a little bit about some of those inspirations that we had earlier, but presented in a different way. And then it's going to completely present the Paladin class as it appears in the second edition Player's Handbook. So all of this is repeated stuff that you would theoretically already own from having the second edition books. And then it's going to get into the Paladin abilities, but it's not going to describe them mechanically. It's going to give you flavor text for how these abilities work and why they exist. So detecting evil intent, it says saving throw bonuses, immunity to disease, turning undead, your bonded mounts, all of that kind of stuff. And so it's all flavor text of how those abilities exist in the world. And this was very common in the second edition era. A lot of books during this time, especially late second edition, are all about flavor text. And again, what nowadays would be called fluff. And I feel bad for that, because it's fluff makes it sound like it's not important. It's really fun to read, but flavor text is easier to write, but I would say it's harder to write well. It's more difficult to write it well, to where it doesn't just come across as filler, which a lot of times, and I'm not saying that with this book, but a lot of times in second edition, it feels like filler text. Okay, so it's going into codes and violations and penalties and all this kind of stuff. There's a whole ceremony of disgrace thing. And then it's going to get into the kits. And this is where I felt like the kits to me were a little bit uninspired versus some of the earlier work that I had seen. So the first kit is called the True Paladin, which is just playing a Paladin. It says this is the typical Paladin described in the Player's Handbook, which to me, I don't know why we're then going to take up space in the book to make it a kit, because you already have the rules to play that. You have the Chevalier, which is the Gentleman Warrior, which is really the way it's described. It's just a standard Paladin. They have a chain of command they have to follow, and that's both a benefit and a hindrance. But there's really not a lot to that one. There's more religious types of Paladins. The Divinate Envoys, Equerries are more of like the Horse Masters. There's the Knight Errant, which is the independent warrior, more like a Ronin in the samurai culture. There's the Expatriates. Ghost Hunters is kind of interesting. Inquisitors, Magicians. You have the Militarists. You have the Sky Riders, which are warriors of the air. So these are people that take flying mounts as their bonded mount. Kind of interesting, I guess, in a fantasy setting. Then you have the Squire, functioning as like an apprentice. And you have the Votary, which is yet another religious-based Paladin kit. And then the Worm Slayer, like a Dragon Slayer. And then it talks about creating new kits. It has rules for trying to create Paladins for demi-humans, because, as you know, we talked about this earlier, you cannot play a Paladin as a demi-human in second edition. Demi-human meaning any non-human playable race. And so they create these interesting mechanics for playing like essentially a fighter cleric with some extra goodies like elven troopers, half-elven heralds, halfling sheriffs, and dwarven forge lighters. So not for gnomes and half-orcs, but for all the other races there. And then it gets into some like proficiencies and talks about that and equipment and magical equipment. And then it's going to get into things like women as paladins and marriage and social background and all this kind of stuff. So again, all very, very flavor text, but if you have your own campaign world, this flavor text might not be relevant to you. And then it's going to get into economics and that kind of thing and strongholds. And it's going to wrap up with basically talking about your orders. So it's going to give you some examples of some paladin orders, which again might be inspirational if you don't have these in your campaign setting already. But if you already do, maybe not super relevant. There's some fictional sources and film and video and novels that you could use, like Three Hearts and Three Lions it mentions specifically. And then it's going to repeat the rules for the first edition Paladin in case you needed that. And then it's going to have a character sheet. So that is our look at the complete Paladin's Handbook for second edition. And then another thing I wanted to look at super quickly is one of my favorite articles from Dragon Magazine. This is Dragon Magazine number 106. And this is from February of 1986. So this is prior to the release of, or it was written prior to the release of Unearthed Arcana, I should say. So even though it's published in 1986, Unearthed Arcana comes out in 1985, but they say specifically that it was written and accepted prior to the publication of Unearthed Arcana. But Christopher Wood is going to write this article, and it's going to be about multiple different kinds of paladin type characters for every different alignment. So it says specifically you should use these as NPCs because they've not been play tested for balance. But this was the first thing that opened my eyes to the idea of having paladins for every single alignment, but that they would be different. You wouldn't just be playing a paladin with the same abilities and have a different alignment. The alignment is going to affect the abilities of the paladin and how you would role play them. And so this article goes through and talks about different types of paladins for lawful neutral, chaotic neutral, and lawful evil, and neutral good, and all these kinds of things. I think it was really, really interesting. They even put level titles in here. The level titles are a little uninspired, but whatever. And there's new spells and new abilities and things like that. And I thought it was a really interesting article. It was one of my favorite ones from back in the day. And so just going to show that, going all the way back to, this is, 12 years at this point after D&D's come out, but people were thinking of paladins of different alignment all the way back then in the early 80s. Just very briefly, I wanted to talk about some of the major changes that happen in the Paladin class when we get to the Wizards of the Coast editions, 3rd, 4th, and 5th. I'm not going to go over the mechanics. I'm not going to make the chart and do all that kind of stuff. I just kind of want to talk about more of the philosophy of how the class is changing. So in 3rd edition, this is actually the 3.5 Player's Handbook, but that's the one that I had most available. So Paladin is going to now become a core class. What people now refer to as a core class is it is no longer a subclass of fighter. It's its own class. And one of the things that's interesting is you see it does have an alignment restriction of lawful good. So they're going to retain that. And it's going to talk about charisma being important and getting a wisdom score of 14 or higher to get the most powerful spells. It still has a D10 hit die like we see. And a lot of these powers are going to be the same. Detect evil, lay on hands, remove disease, turning undead, and then you're going to get access to clerical spells. It's going to start actually at level 6 instead of at level 9, but it's only going to go up to 4th level spells. So paladins are what are known as a half caster on 3.5. So a lot of the details and the mechanics are going to be different, but overall, I would say that this is still the Paladin in the 3.5 in the 3rd edition still has a lot in common and is built upon the bones of the classes that we saw in 1st and 2nd edition Advanced Dungeons and Dragons, and of course going all the way back to Greyhawk. Now that's going to change when we get to 4th edition. 4th is difficult to talk about when you're comparing editions of D&D because it is so different from all of the other editions. That's not a good or a bad thing. I'm just stating that it is different enough that it's very difficult to compare and contrast levels and powers and things like that because the way that the Paladin is built. Now, 3.5, or I'm sorry, fourth edition starts to back off on alignment requirements and things like that. So there's nothing in here about alignment. It talks about key abilities being strength, charisma, and wisdom. That all stays the same as what you would assume. Okay. But there's really nothing in here about being, one being like for alignment, like lawful good or anything like that. There's nothing in here. However, it talks about the typical types of paladin that you can be. So they talk about two different kinds of paladins in here. The avenging paladin, who burns with a desire to punish the wicked and smite unbelievers. And then there's also the protecting paladin, emphasizing defense, guarding allies, and healing and bolstering them with a few of your powers. Okay, and then it talks about like an overview, and then it says, as far as religion, it says warriors wielding divine power can be found in the service of any deity, even evil or chaotic ones. So this is telling you that you can play an evil or chaotic paladin. It says the majority serve good and or lawful. But the other thing it says specifically is that you have to serve a deity. So that's not even in 3.5, but in 4th edition, it tells you very specifically you have to serve a deity. So they're really going to focus on that aspect of the character. Now, in 5th edition, this is the one released in 2014. I do not have the new 2024 edition of Dungeons & Dragons, mostly just because I didn't think I was going to be playing it. So I just felt like I didn't need to necessarily pick it up. I don't want to keep buying books of things that I'm not going to play. Now, in this particular one also, they are not going to have any kind of alignment restrictions in 5th edition. And it's going to tell us, however, when they talk about the different powers and stuff of the paladin, you see here, it says things like your blessed touch can heal wounds. That's lay on hands. And then it's going to go into kind of like different oaths that you're going to take. And so it says you're going to take a sacred oath. And the 3 different types of oaths that you can take in here are the oath of devotion. And it says the oath of devotion binds a paladin to the loftiest ideals of justice, virtue, and order. And these are called cavaliers or white knights or holy warriors. So that's one oath that you can take. You can also take the oath of the ancients, which is as old as the race as elves and the rituals of the druids, and they're sometimes called fey knights, green knights, or horn knights. But they swear their oath, cast their lot with the side of the light in the cosmic struggle against darkness because they love the beautiful and life-giving things of the world. Okay, so both of those are, quote unquote, good. Then you have the oath of vengeance, a solemn commitment to punish those who have committed a grievous sin. And then the way it describes it, says they're called avengers or dark knights. Their own purity is not as important as delivering justice. So that might be skirting the line, but all 3 of those oaths are very much in the realm of like being good or, being pure, whatever you want to say. Okay. So it talks about fighting the greater evil. And these are like your tenets of vengeance for that vengeance oath. And so even though there doesn't seem to be, at least as far as I saw in here, an alignment restriction like what we're used to, the way the class is described in 5th edition is that it is kind of intended to be sort of like a good, righteous, virtuous person out for justice. Now, my understanding, again, is in the 2024 edition of D&D that they have removed that. And they're leaning into the idea that a paladin is really just a holy warrior and you can be of any alignment. So kind of going back to how it was described in 4th edition. And also in the 2024 edition makes it very clear that the powers of the paladin don't come from a deity. It comes just from the oath itself. So you take an oath and the virtue, by virtue of you taking that oath, that gives you the powers to get all of your divine abilities that a paladin gets, not coming from praying for a deity to bestow them upon you. So that's a difference. And I would love to hear from folks what they think about that. And, if they think that was a good thing, if that's a progress in the class or if that was a mistake. So I definitely share that in the comments below. But that's my brief just look at the Wizards of the Coast editions of the Paladin class. So at the end here, I just wanted to talk briefly about some ways that we can try to differentiate clerics from paladins. And the reason I bring this up is because it is very muddied. Gygax in the Player's Handbook here from 1978 says, this class of character bears a certain resemblance to religious orders of knighthood of medieval times. Okay. And then Len Lakofka repeats that, as I talked about earlier, in an article in Dragon Magazine, and says how the cleric is based on that. But we've also seen that these religious orders like Templars and Hospitallers, the Teutonic Knights, and there were dozens of these organizations, were used as inspirations for the Paladin as well. And so I think it starts to get a little bit confusing. Okay. So I think one of the ways to think about it is to remember that although the cleric can wear armor, any kind of armor, and, has some decent skill with weapons, not on the level of the fighter or the paladin, but can, hold their own, we'll put it that way. They really, I think, should be more mediators first than warriors. Of course, you can role play them however you want, but if you're trying to distinguish, especially if you have a party that has both a cleric and a paladin, the cleric might be more of like a mediator. And they are more concerned with miracles, like they're praying to their deity, versus like mastery of a specific skill. And their devotion really is more through, like, say, obedience. Okay, as converse to the paladin, paladins are soldiers first. That's where they start out, as soldiers, and they're soldiers of belief. They train as fighters first, and then they take on this sacred burden. They're called to become paladins in a way. And so their faith then is displayed through action, and their abilities are earned through purity. Okay. And so it's devotion through virtue, as opposed to for the cleric, where it's devotion through obedience. So if you kind of think about the source of their power, for the cleric, it's gifted by a deity, but for a paladin, it's earned through virtue and oath. And then their relationship with their deity, or to the divine powers, or however you want to say it. For a cleric, it's more like as a servant or an intermediary between their god and then like their flock, the people that they're helping out, they're overseeing, they're shepherding, right? But for a paladin, that relationship is as a champion or an exemplar of that deity's abilities and what the deity oversees. Clerics express their faith through prayer, ritual, and healing. Paladins express their faith through action, courage, and sacrifice. And then as far as like a moral tension, which is always kind of fun to have with divine characters, for a cleric, I think, believing there might be a temptation to pride, right? Believing that they are speaking directly for their god. And that could create a little bit of some moral tension. Whereas for a paladin, it's probably more of a temptation for zeal, believing that they're carrying out their god's will. I know it's a small nuance, but the way that you role play that could have an impact on the difference between a cleric and a paladin. So at the table, the cleric is really kind of like the spiritual counselor for the party, whereas the paladin is more of their moral compass. That's a great way to kind of distinguish those two as far as like how they approach it. So in short, I think, the cleric asks for miracles. The paladin actually kind of becomes a miracle. And what I mean by that is, well, I think hopefully you get it through this discussion that we've had, but especially considering how a paladin generates their ability scores. And if you're doing it and not cheating, and I'm not talking about using the crazy methods from Unearthed Arcana, because those almost guarantee you can play whatever you want. But if you use a standard ability score generation method, even some of the funky ones from the Dungeon Master's Guide, it is still very, very difficult to qualify to be a paladin. Particularly if you're going to roll your scores in order and hope that you get a high score, a 17 or an 18 in your charisma so that you can qualify. And so because of that, paladins should be very, very rare in the world. Most people would probably never even see one or meet one, right? They shouldn't just be your average everyday Joe walking up and down the street. They're special because of these requirements to become a paladin. And so therefore they could be seen by the average person as being sort of like a miracle, a divine expression of a deity and that a champion of that deity, right? So if you think about that and think about how limited and rare they are in your campaign world, that can help you with a little bit of world building, right? So I talked about having these paladin orders, but I don't believe that there should be, dozens and dozens of paladin orders with hundreds of members sprinkled all throughout your world. I feel like you should have a very small handful of these people. And it's almost like, you could think of it like the Green Lantern Corps. Like when one of them dies, the ring goes and finds someone else who is worthy and lifts them up, and then they kind of replace that person. But there's like a set number, and it's never going to get bigger than that number. Now, I'm not going to quibble about how they keep adding more and more Green Lanterns, and there's like, eight of them for planet Earth or whatever. But you get the idea, hopefully, that could be a way that you could think about paladins. There's a fixed number in the world, and it always has to be at that number. So when one of them moves on to the next afterlife or whatever, a new champion is going to come up to replace them. And that's that calling that I kind of talked about. So again, just some world building there, but just some ways that you could think about the ideas of using paladins in your world and distinguishing them from clerics. So that's going to wrap up this particular video on paladins. I really hope that you enjoyed it. I would love to hear your comments down below, especially if you think, like with the newer editions, like stripping the alignment restrictions from the paladin. Do you think that's a good thing, or do you think it's a bad thing? Now, I know most of my viewers here tend to be old timers like me that started with, the lawful good restrictions, or maybe even just the lawful restriction from Greyhawk. But a lot of you also do play newer editions, and that's great. And so I would love to hear kind of the pros and cons, what you think of that alignment restriction. I think that's the biggest change to the paladin. I mean, there's mechanical changes as well, but that's kind of just part of the system that you're running. But one of the biggest changes, I think, is removing the alignment restriction and kind of changing what a paladin really is, like the background and the flavor behind the class. So I would love to hear that in the comments below from you folks. And just any other comments you had about the video, always feel free to drop a comment if there's a topic that you think I should cover in a future video, and you can put all that in the comments below. And then while you're down there, you'll find places to join me on social media. You'll find links to my blog, and you'll find ways that you can support Daddy Rolled a One. The first way is by becoming a super fan. You can do that right here on YouTube without leaving the video. Just click that little heart icon with the $sign and join this list of very fine folks who have been contributing to my videos, many of whom contribute every single time I post a new video. So like that's at least once a week. So if you do that, you will get your name listed here, and it's basically in perpetuity. So I really appreciate that. The second thing that you can do is by buying merchandise from my shop. You can buy t-shirts, hoodies, mugs, and tote bags from my spread shop, or you can buy paper goods like stickers, posters, and notebooks from my Redbubble shop. And these are exclusive designs that you will only find here at my shop for Daddy Roll the One. So those are not versions that you will find anywhere else. You only get them at my shop. And then lastly, you can buy my supplement for old school fantasy class and level role-playing games, specifically old school essentials. It's called Alchemy, Explosives, and Inventions. So it's about playing characters that are skilled in a specific type of area. And so what I did was take the original 7 character classes from the BX line of D&D, and then I reframed them as things like cleric, apothecaries, or relic hunters, or like fighter sappers or artillerists, magic user, arcane investigators, as an example, or thief, like say saboteurs, merchants, or courtiers. So you can find new character classes in here as well. There's alchemists, demolitionists, and inventors. There's dozens and dozens of random tables to help make these concepts and classes come to life. There's pages of new equipment. There's a 3-story guild hall map with NPCs, adventure hooks, secrets, rumors, that kind of thing. You can use it as a base of operations or to just to explore during the campaign. And then I have advice on running expert themed campaigns with inspirational media types. You can get all of this as a soft cover print on demand or as a PDF with either a parchment color background, as you see here, or plain white if that's easier to read. You'll find the links for Drive-Thru RPG to buy this below. And thank you so much for your support. And that's going to wrap up this video. Thank you again so very much for watching. Stay safe, happy gaming, and I'll talk to you next time. Now for the bonus content, what I was drinking and what I was listening to when I made my notes for this video. Slide the album over really quick, and I don't think I've done this whiskey before, and I don't have much left, so I thought I would share a little with you on here. This is, I'm going to say Amrut, but this is a single malt whiskey from India, actually. So I got this years ago, or I thought it was really interesting. So whiskey is made all over the world. Now, this is made in a country without an E in the name. So we see whiskey is spelled S-K-I, not S-K-Y, not S-K-E-Y. The countries with an E thing is kind of it's not a hard and fast rule, but usually places like America and Ireland, because both have E's in the name. This isn't why. It's just it's a way that you can quickly try to tell where the whiskey's from. Usually put an E in it, and then places like Canada and Scotland and Japan typically don't. Now, it's not a hard and fast rule, and again, it has nothing really to do with the name of the country. It's just that it's worked out that way, so it's kind of coincidental. But anyway, this is a really interesting one. They have to age the whiskey, I guess, a little bit less in, I believe this is in Bangalore, where they're going to age this because of the heat. They don't age it as long, and I'm not quite sure what that has to do with it. I'm not really good on that part of the whiskey thing of like what the intense heat has to do with the maturation and the oak casks. But I'd say, very citrusy, nutty, little stone fruit maybe on the nose. And then on the palate, it's not an intense whiskey. It's very smooth. Should have said cheers, by the way. Cheers, and thanks for watching through the bonus content. Yeah, some like allspice coming through on the palate. Again, a little bit of citrus, and the barley, and there's a slight smokiness to it, but not very much. It's not like a heavy peated Scotch, like a Scotch whiskey. So, I typically sip this neat, although I did make a cocktail with it once. I made an old fashioned, and I did I made a cardamom clove infused honey syrup, and I used that with this to make an old fashioned with a little bit of orange peel, and it was delicious. Okay, so for the album, this is The Police, Ghost in the Machine, 1981. And one of the reasons I want to show this, I like The Police a lot, but I bought this, and when I bought it at a place here in Hollywood called Record Parlor, this was years ago before my friend opened his shop, it was shrink wrapped and it was still sealed. The record had not been opened. And I was like, do I open it? And then I was like, yeah, I bought it to listen to it, not because I didn't buy it to collect it. They printed a ton of these, so it's not even sealed. It's not all worth all that much. So I went ahead and cracked it open years ago and have been playing it. And it's just it's a fun record, classic Police tracks on here. You've got Spirits in the Material World, Every Little Thing She Does Is Magic. Those are probably the two best known ones, but Demolition Man's going to be on here. And of course that was featured in the movie. Not a great movie, or at least not one of my favorites. You might like it. It's a fun little sleeve here though. And here's the record. You can see it's in great shape. Again, because it was sealed, I've only played it a few times. I try to mix it up when I'm playing my records and not listen to the same record like twice in a row, unless I get lazy and I don't want to go find another one. I try to keep a stash here in the office, but my main record collection is in the front of the house. Okay, so that's the record. That is the whiskey. I hope that you enjoyed the video, and thank you so very much for watching again, and cheers, and I will talk to you next time.